Okay, today I'm speaking with Danny Roddy. Danny is host of the Generative Energy podcast, author of Hair Like a Fox, and a longtime student of Dr. Ray Peat. Danny, I was hoping you might begin by talking about how you first became interested in Ray's work.
Oh man, I think that's like a 30 or 45 minute story. I think I became interested in nutrition shortly after high school, mainly because I thought I was losing like a substantial amount of hair, and it was a little bit worrisome to me. And also, my scalp hurt. It felt inflamed, and so I started down like kind of a traditional path of trying to find answers, going to different doctors and things. And I think they prescribed me like a topical steroid for my like a shampoo or something. And even back then, I remember the doctor that prescribed me the topical steroid was just like an unnecessary asshole. Like I didn't understand why he was just a mean guy. And then I came to learn that that was just kind of the MO of most doctors. And so, anyways, I'm like in this pursuit of trying to stop my hair loss. And then I eventually kind of ditched the medical paradigm. It seemed like it was not going anywhere. And I start modifying my nutrition, and I go from vegetarianism to veganism in like 2007. And then I get into like low carb stuff that was like very popular at the time. And then the first time I had heard about carnivore, just the meat and water style, was probably sometime in 2008 or so. And I did that for about 2 years, just like meat and water. And through all these different like dietary adventures, I think my health sometimes would get better, sometimes would get worse. Sometimes my hair would get thicker, sometimes it would get significantly thinner. And my mood would go up, my mood would go down. You get the idea, you know? Like I'd have like limited success on every approach. And during all that time, I was trying to like put a model together as well and try to figure out how things worked. And so I was always attracted to like big thinkers, like people that were trying to put it all together. And so I can't remember when I first heard about Ray. I think it might have been like maybe the beginning of 2011 or so. I actually thought he was somebody else, and I disregarded him completely. But the thing that really attracted me to him is I had read a lot on the internet that like hair loss was not just the result of a high androgenic hormone called or androgen hormone called DHT or dihydrotestosterone, that it might be that process of balding might involve other hormones such as cortisol and prolactin and estrogen, aldosterone, et cetera. And so when I went to Ray Peat's site in early 2011, he was talking about those hormones. And I was like, oh, this is interesting. Like, I don't recall many people actually talking about these things. And so reading his work was one thing. It's very challenging. But then I was lucky because he started doing lots of audio interviews at the time. And I don't know what it is, but he just came off as so authentic, and like he actually knew what he was talking about. And and I had been in the health scene for a long time and seen paleo and vegan and vegetarian people come off as, I thought, unauthentic. And there was just something different about him. And also you could like email him and he'd email you back. Like, I mean, try getting anybody with a modicum of popularity to do that, you know? And so I don't know, it just started like a rabbit hole effect, or a snowball effect of becoming interested in him. And it really hasn't ended. I think he's just a very interesting person. But I'd be remiss if I didn't say like his work is kind of like in a tradition of other scientists like Otto Warburg and William F. Koch and Albert St. Georgi and other philosophical thinkers like Bucky Fuller and J.C. Bose and all these just random interesting thinkers. And so I think he's more than just a nutrition person. I think he's kind of this like painter, biologist, philosopher, that like a modern day Aristotle or something. Like we're lucky. I feel fortunate to be living at the same time as him and be able to like pick his brain about things.
Yeah, I think that's what I find so interesting about him is he's not just specialized in one field. And I've always been interested in the link between like philosophy and physiology. Um, Growing up, I read a lot of like Nietzsche, who is obviously a philosopher, but he would speak about physiology and how like the body, diet, environment, etc., how these things influence personality, perspective, so on and so forth. And then, like, since reading him, I haven't really read anyone else who uh, does that. And I feel like Ray, because he has such a broad spectrum of like knowledge, he's able to do that. He's able to talk about how, you know, physiology impacts politics, impacts philosophy, and the fact that he's also an artist. He's, yeah, I think that eclectic range of interest definitely makes him an interesting character. I actually, the first I'm curious, this is a bit of a strange question and it could be totally mean nothing to you, but the first time I heard about Ray Peat was not that long ago. It was probably, I think I read this book in like 2019. So it's a book called Bronze Age Mindset. The author is Bronze Age Pervert, which is
Oh, yeah,
obviously
yeah.
a pseudonym. And he's sort of like the unofficial leader of right-wing bodybuilder Twitter. Now, what I find interesting is like Ray Peat is like super popular in this like Twitter sphere.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, like, do you know
Yeah,
anything
yeah.
about this? Like, have you come across it or?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I've dabbled in all of those scenes, and I have friends in all different political points of view and things. And for a long time, I don't do it much now these days, but for a long time, I'd monitor Ray's name on the internet and just see who was talking about him, you know.
Mm,
And like maybe in 2000, I don't know, like 2010 to 2015, it just people would just clown on him like 24/7, you know, like
mm,
the idea of eating sugar and drinking Coke and like just making fun of him, saying it was like a orange juice and milk diet or something just farcical, you know. And I don't know when it must have been around 2016 or 17 or maybe 2018 or around there that uh, that whatever BAP was like, whatever he considers himself, like that had picked up pretty big with the seed oils and things, and that's of course exploded huge recently, you know. And so uh, yeah, again, maybe they saw the same authenticity that I picked up on, and he's just, there's so much bullshit and nonsense in the nutrition space, and so finding like Ray is just this revelation. I think, you know. And so but yeah, I don't. I remember bouncing that off him maybe a few years ago. I was like, the like the right wing people are really into you, Ray, and he's like, oh, that's very good. Like, I don't think he cares who enjoys his work.
mm.
I think he probably just appreciates people proliferating it around the web.
Yeah, because it's interesting. I don't know much about his politics per se. Like, I get the impression that, like, yeah, I don't think he's one of those people who you can simplify in that sense. I don't think it would be appropriate to say, oh, he's this or that. But it's it is interesting because I think I do recall you asking him once about the right, and he said it's interesting. Often, right wing people are more nutrition focused. So he gave the example of like fluoride back in the day in like the 60s and 70s, and how all of these right wingers would get kind of really alarmed about that. Whilst and he noticed that actually the people who tend to be the most um concerned about the body tend to be right wing. I just remember him saying that in one of your talks with him.
In a newsletter, he specifically points out that again, I don't even know what it's called these days, but like the liberal progressive left was basically taken over by the CIA. And I'm not saying therefore the right is correct or something. I think they're both compromised. But something you learn about Ray is that if you try to put him in a box, he'll immediately escape. And
Mm,
so I think if people were healthy, maybe a wide variety of systems could work. But
mm,
I do know that he thinks like the trillions of cells in your body are unified for one goal.
mm,
I can't obviously speak for him, but I think he thinks that's possible on a grander societal level. And so some kind of communitarian effort or something like that.
mm.
But I don't think anything can work if people are horrifically sick and things are so bad right now. I really doubt any system would work, you know? And so, I think it's complicated, but I've been chipping away at asking him those questions for a long time, but I never wanted to go too down the rabbit hole of just becoming a political person, because I thought it's kind of like arguing nutrition. It's almost like 100% toxic on the internet, and so
Mm.
it's interesting to dabble in those topics and to learn, but like, I mean, just arguing ad nauseum with people on the internet about this stuff is soul crushing, and it's probably better to find something else to do.
I agree. I totally agree. I find because I do talk about like politics from time to time, but I could never imagine dedicating myself completely because it's such a, yeah, a swamp. So you mentioned
Yeah.
sickness, and I think that that's like a pretty appropriate segue because I'm going to call this conversation like a gentle introduction to Ray Peat, I think, because most of the questions that I've written down are like pretty basic. Like if you've been interested in his work for a long time, I don't think that this is going to be the conversation for you, but because I'm mainly just interested in the basics. Like I said, I've only been, I should say that I tried to read Ray's generative energy book and I couldn't do it. I don't have any sort of scientific background. I don't, a lot of these concepts went totally, just the language went over my head, right? Like there's certain words or hormones or whatever that I just didn't even know. I didn't even know what a thyroid hormone was until quite recently. But I was sort of thinking that this could maybe serve as like a nice introduction for someone who perhaps hasn't come across any of Ray's work. So I thought we'd begin with like the super basic question, which is just like, what is the metabolism and why does it matter?
Yeah, by the way, I wasn't laughing at you. I think Ray is just known for people like getting into his books and being mystified. Like,
Mm.
for example, the one that's even more challenging to read is it's called Mind and Tissue. And Ray will be referencing all these different thinkers, so you'll have to stop and like look up what like Kantianism is or whatever when you're reading it, and so it's like very dense. But anyways, there might be a formal definition of metabolism, but I thought it was the aggregation of or accumulation of all metabolic energy being produced from cells to keep the person alive, all metabolic processes in the body. And so that's kind of what I normally think of it when we're speaking about it. But the hormones and what a person eats and the person's environment and their upbringing and what their parents ate and what their grandparents ate, all of that influences, I think, a person's metabolism. And yeah, and another way of thinking about it is obviously, Albert St. George said that cells need energy for all of their local activities, but also to maintain their structure. And then cells form tissues, your tissues form organs, and your organs form you. And so maybe a way of looking at health is focusing on the cellular metabolism, thinking about how that works, and then trying to construct some types of strategies to improve cellular metabolism, because that's something that tends to dip from adolescence to older age. And so, and that can be correlated with things like the temperature and the pulse rate. Like I have a reference that says, I think neonates or newborn babies have a pulse rate of like 120. And by the time they're 12 years old, it's 80 beats per minute. And then that's true with the temperature as well. It tends to decline throughout a person's lifespan. And the temperature and pulse are a good proxy for the aggregation of cellular energy in the body. And then the important part about thyroid is it's the hormone of respiration, stimulating cells to make energy. So anyway, long story short, the temperature and pulse being useful metrics. And then if a person is worried about their current level of health, possibly trying to emulate the state of a child, like an 8-year-old or a 10-year-old. And I doubt many 8-year-olds and 10-year-olds are healthy these days, but maybe 50 years ago they were.
Mm. So everyone knows this, like, because obviously metabolism, it's like, yeah, like you said, it's if you've got a high metabolism, you've got a high heart rate and a high temperature, and everyone knows this when it's like a sort of perhaps a warmish summer day, and you see an older person wearing a cardigan, and on the
Yeah.
other side, you know, often in winter, you'll see a young boy or whatever running around with basically like no clothes on and steam's coming off of them, right? Like it's like in there, it's like yeah, the so it's like yeah, that you can see right, and we all know that the latter can eat basically whatever he wants and not put on any weight and stay extremely slim, and that's because he's got an extremely high metabolism. What I think I found interesting, going back to what I said before, is I've always been interested in the link between like physiology and psychology and how like your body can influence your mind. And what I found so interesting about like your work and Ray's work is how you guys talk about like the link between like metabolism, intelligence, openness, creativity, consciousness. So you know, having a high metabolism isn't just about staying like lean and slim. It's actually like you associate it with, you know, almost like higher states of consciousness. Am I correct in saying that?
I, that's one of the weakest areas of my understanding. But yeah, I think that's right. You know, I think the things that decrease self-awareness and like awareness of the world and things are the stress hormones like cortisol and estrogen and prolactin and adrenaline and things. It's like it's really hard to have a philosophical conversation when somebody's like all jacked up on adrenaline. Or do you feel like being intimate with somebody when you're in a extreme stress state? You know, it's like it's back to primitive functioning and just trying to stay alive, I think. But yeah, Ray has an article. I think it's called "Intelligence and Metabolism," and he references a guy named Broda Barnes pretty frequently. And Broda Barnes wrote a few books. One of them is called Hypothyroidism: The Unsuspected Illness. And I think in that book he says the difference between an idiot and a genius is like a few grains of thyroid hormone. And so, yeah, like yeah, I don't know, maybe like thinking about Maslow's hierarchy of needs or something, and having a poor metabolism just makes people think about base instincts and doesn't let them move past that and ask the big questions or the Schrodinger question, like the what is life question. And so, yeah, and you know, I talk to a lot of people that are feeling depressed or lost any kind of zest for life, you know, and I think the hormones are involved in those processes, you know, and it's like not controversial at all that depressed people tend to have high cortisol, and I think that's usually a result of lower thyroid function and or intestinal problems, eating poorly and things. And so there's a reason why in that right-wing bodybuilder community that the carrot salad has made its rounds so quickly, is because I think just by improving intestinal function, you influence like a battery of different hormones that tend to make people feel good. And so, yeah, man, I think I was a sensitive kid. And so I think I was always asking myself, why do I feel the way I do? And Ray actually, I think, has some answers to those questions. And who doesn't need help feeling good these days? Like the last 2 years have been pretty awful, you know? So I think that's what's valuable about him is creating, not to sound cheesy, but like creating like a toolbox of things that a person can try to feel better and resist the constant onslaught of stress that we all experience every day.
Okay, yeah. So we've talked a little bit about, you just talked about hormones, and I think that this is important. So like perhaps we could just speak a little bit about like the relationship between the thyroid hormone and metabolism.
Yeah. So the thyroid gland mostly, I'm skipping a lot of parts here, but the thyroid gland mostly produces T4 or thyroxine. And then that thyroxine travels on proteins to go to the liver. And then the liver primarily converts the thyroxine to triiodothyronine or T3. And so if you hang out enough Ray Peat circles, you'll probably hear people talking about T4 and T3 all the time. And so those are just the primary thyroid hormones, and T3 happens to be the hormone with all the interesting pro-respiratory anti-stress benefits. And then the counter side of this is that without producing enough T3, a person can't produce, they sometimes call them the hormones of youth or the youth associated hormones. And so they're pregnenolone, progesterone, and DHEA. And so you need thyroid hormone to turn over cholesterol and vitamin A into pregnenolone inside of cells, and then to further metabolize those into progesterone and dihydroepiandrosterone, or DHEA. And so, long story short, the way to think about this is like thyroid is the basic anti-stress hormone. It's turning over cholesterol into pregnenolone, progesterone, and DHEA, which are higher in youth. And then as a person gets older or is exposed to chronic stress and a bunch of toxic shit, they tend to produce less and less of these hormones. And then they'll begin to compensate with more and more of the stress or adaptive hormones, such as adrenaline and cortisol, aldosterone, and estrogen, serotonin, et cetera. So it's kind of like a seesaw, like a metabolic energy seesaw, where it's higher in youth, and then it declines and starts going towards the chronic stress trajectory. And I think the chronic stress trajectory is associated with all the problems you can possibly think of, as minor as like sleep issues or insomnia, to libido. Like, I talk to 20-year-olds that have like libido issues and stuff. You know, I'm not laughing. I'm just saying it's like ridiculous. You know, our environment is so toxic that people are having these problems younger and younger. And so, yeah, I think I got a little off track there. But the hormone, the thyroid, is like the thing orchestrating everything. And so I think that's why there's so much emphasis on it. It's what's like separating us from like lower level organisms, because it's such a important thing for our complex structure to maintain it and to move forward.
It's like so yeah, the relationship between cortisol, which is like, yeah, I guess a stress hormone, and then thyroid is like, yeah, they're basically, it's like a seesaw, right? So when cortisol goes up, it's pretty safe to assume that thyroid will go down, right? And yeah, high cortisol means low metabolism, and high thyroid would mean presumably, it's probably simplifying to a huge extent, but yeah, a speedy metabolism. And what you've been saying about the primitive, am I right in thinking about that quite literally? Like, what you're saying is you're being taken back to a sort of survival state where you're only, I guess, maybe consuming, you know, a small amount of calories per day, and the body is having to slow its metabolism down because it's like, I'm in a state of stress, I'm in an emergency state. And then it's like you're focused only on survival rather than these other things like creativity.
Exactly. Yeah, there might be periods of novelty, but if the temperature and pulse are very low, a person will just kind of be drifting through life, or sleepwalking through life, I think, or they won't be experiencing life to the same potential that somebody with higher thyroid function would be. So not in an elite way, just like that they elitist point of view way, but like I think they could just solve health problems and become the best versions of themselves.
The sleepwalking, when you say sleepwalking, that's kind of a fitting, right? Because whenever an animal is going to go into hibernation, it needs to slow down its metabolism. So so when you say sleepwalking, or you can almost kind of think about that literally, right?
Yeah, I didn't think of it like that, but I think you're right. Yeah, the processes that increase in stress, they put animals into a state of hibernation. So, for example, I think you want to talk about it later, but the serotonin is majorly responsible for animal hibernation. And then Hans Selye, who was basically the guy that figured out how the stress response worked, he specifically says in one of his 1947 textbooks that he could wake up hibernating animals by giving them a little bit of thyroid hormone. And so yeah, and again, not to jump ahead here, but like I think the powers that be would probably want citizenry sleepwalking, you know, or in a state of chronic fear and very easy to manipulate and to move around and things like that, because it's just it's just a sad state of affairs that people look forward to drinking every weekend or something, and that's like this pinnacle of fun or something like that. And so I realize it's all been constructed for them, and that they're just victims of an overall some social planner or something like. But it's just like I have a friend here who's about 80 years old, and he just tells me stories about him and his brothers. and his life just sounds like a TV show. It sounds so fun, and I experienced a little bit of that, but I think that's going by the wayside with people growing up just playing video games or something like that. That would be again like a sad state of affairs for or being on the phone or iPad all the time or something. It's just probably going to make their life a lot worse in the long run.
I was just thinking about coconut oil, which is obviously recommended by, I think Ray recommends it for people who maybe are trying to lose weight. He himself claims that he lost a lot of weight just eating a little bit of coconut oil each day. And I can't remember where I read this, but apparently, just going back to the hibernation thing, that if you feed like a bear diet, like sort of things such as like coconut oil, apparently that can prevent them from going into a state of hibernation. Is that because coconut oil is like promoting like thyroid hormone or something like that?
I think that's right. I can't remember the guy's name. It starts with a G, but he had a bunch of papers on how he could promote hibernation with the polyunsaturated fats and then inhibit it with the saturated fats. And so, and there's lots of people doing work on that these days. And so I think that is right. And yeah, you said it earlier. It's just like a conservation mechanism to do more with less. And so if your body just senses alarm signals, it's not really like useful to have an extremely high rate of metabolism. You would just burn through your tissues and experience like cachexia or wasting. And so it's just an adaptive response that's useful to keep the person alive, but then it becomes pathological, leading to depression and reduced virility and sleep problems, and I mean every other problem you can think of.
Like polyunsaturated fats, because am I like, a lot of people would associate them with vegetable oils, but they're actually naturally occurring. You can find them in things like like a certain fish, and is that right?
Yeah, correct. Yep.
Yeah. So presumably, like when a bear is going to go into hibernation, it might seek out food such as nuts and fish in order to slow its metabolism down. I don't know.
I haven't done too much investigation on it, but from what I remember, I think that is true.
Oh, okay, cool. So yeah, I did a ketogenic diet for probably 2 or so years. I wasn't always completely strict, but I was pretty strict. And I experienced like a lot of sleeplessness, a lot of energy, but it was this sort of restless energy. So I'll explain to you like what my life looked like at the time. I was working at like a gym basically, and I would go to work all day. I wouldn't eat. I would do OMAD. So I would do one meal a day, and it would be like a ketogenic meal. And I would train every single day. So I would do like a pretty intense, like resistance training session. And I would do it sort of either at the start or the end. And I would also do like hour-long saunas. And I did that like, I don't want to say every day a week, but I did it like enough. Yeah, I would have been extremely low body fat. But then I noticed things like sleeplessness, hair thinning, a bunch of like, yeah, bad side effects. And I had energy. I had like almost boundless energy, but it was a real restless energy. Like I was running off adrenaline. I could tell that I was running off adrenaline. And I think that that's a pretty common experience for people who do keto. But I think that for me, it was mixed up with like all of these other stress inducing activities.
Yeah, it sounds like you like doubled down on the stressful activities with like the sauna and things. But man, it's good to have those experiences because you get to be them with a different way of eating. I have that guy I mentioned earlier, Han Selye, and then there's another reference that's a little bit newer in the 80s, and they talk about how running on stress hormones like adrenaline or cortisol can feel good for a while. And my buddy a long time ago called it the catecholamine honeymoon. So it's like fun and useful until it's not anymore, and the person just completely breaks down and like burns out basically. And so, yeah, it's hard because a lot of people will move from like standard American diet to something like keto, and I don't doubt them. Like I think they really do feel better, but any kind of nutrition that promotes chronic stress or mimics it in the case of keto it's probably going to be brutal to be on long term. And so I think so many of kind of the, I don't even know what to call it, like the people that are interested in the bioenergetic approach or just bioenergetics in general, are a lot of them are ex low carb, ex carnivore, ex keto, and they've probably done veganism and vegetarianism too. Like I think my trajectory is pretty common, and so. And then the funny thing is, Ray is kind of like the end of the line. I don't really know what's after Ray, because yeah, but yeah, everybody thinks it's crazy until they feel the effects of those types of diets and things, and so or they start feeling freezing cold or something in July when the weather is like 80 degrees Fahrenheit or something. So yeah, experience is the base of all knowledge, and sometimes you got to brutalize your body to figure out something.
Yeah, for sure. And that so obviously that this is like a stress inducing diet, because this sort of brings us to perhaps carbs and cortisol and the relationship between the two, because um sugar, I'm right in thinking that one of the main reasons that sugar's promoted by people such as yourself and Ray is that it reduces cortisol. Is that the right way of framing it?
Yeah, and then that is true. The fructose, especially, like sucrose, is roughly half glucose, half fructose.
Mm,
And the fructose is very good at refilling the liver's store of sugar called glycogen. And
mm,
so that helps a person better resist stress. So when they're not eating, the liver can release sugar to avoid them having to activate their adrenals to increase adrenaline and cortisol and the other suite of hormones. One of the other things is stress can block multiple parts of like the respiratory chain in a cell. So from like glycolysis to the Krebs cycle to the electron transport chain. And it just so happens that fructose can like bypass those blocks. And so in terms of like promoting energy, real biological energy production, resulting in the ATP and CO2 and water, fructose is very useful. And so, coming from a low carb background, they almost place everything that's bad onto fructose. So they have these weird, I'm using air quotes here, but like ancestrally consistent arguments about it. It's not as popular as it was maybe 5 or 10 years ago, but yeah, but the sugar, the person craving something sweet, I think, is a huge clue that this is a basic biological signal. Craving something sweet when they're stressed out is a basic biological signal. And like we've been taught from expert culture, it's like ignore every signal that your body is telling you and
mm.
follow what somebody else says. It'd be kind of similar to say, oh, Russell, do you have to go to the bathroom? Oh, just hold it as long as possible. It's like telling you to ignore your basic needs and things. And I think telling a person to try to get rid of their sugar craving is like exactly the same thing.
It's actually interesting, because I too still will often use like it's what our ancestors did. But if you stop and think about like what our ancestors experienced, like a lot of the time it was prolonged famine, and presumably like if what we're saying about the metabolism and consciousness is true, then anyone in that, well, a lot of our ancestors were in prolonged states of stress where they wouldn't have been able to think about anything like higher than their basic survival needs. So I guess you could stop and kind of go, well, why should that be the model? Like, why should that be what we focus on? And then the second thing I guess would be like, well, the our ancestors weren't dealing with, like cars and the rest of it. So it's I still am like, I still think that like eating like your grandparents is probably like a pretty useful heuristic for most. It's definitely better than going keto or something, just telling people eat like your great grandparents did. That's probably a useful heuristic. I'm not sure that necessarily telling them to eat like their ancestors is.
I mean, I couldn't agree more. That, yeah, it's. That was I made a video about this like exact topic, that like people in the health world with these different dietary paradigms were starting at different places and trying to achieve different things. And so like the bioenergetic or metabolic stuff is almost completely different than the keto stuff. Like they're trying to slow things down, and all of Ray's work is about speeding things up. So they're like completely in opposition with each other. So and then if you go on keto and you feel the effects of slowing things down, like a bad libido or sleep problems, or you find that you always want to argue with people, like you're like, man, this sucks. Is there a different way of being? Like, can I be more resistant to the annoying person, or something like that? And then you experiment, and if something feels good, and you can move in that direction. But I mean, I couldn't agree more. The paleo stuff is kind of interesting, but I think it's very limiting to frame things through that lens.
Yeah, and it's also just funny to think like when the average person goes on a health kick, like they basically turn to like high poofer foods, like foods that will slow down their metabolism. So as you're well aware, right, we've got this problem with obesity. And the most common explanation for it is like, well, people are eating too much and they're exercising too little. Now, I know that you're you're a health coach, and you're probably often dealing with people who perhaps are overweight. I don't know if that's always going to be the case, but um, you could tell them to eat less and exercise more, but that's going to increase their cortisol, which could end up slowing down their metabolism. What would someone who's perhaps a little overweight, basically, what do you think? How do you explain the obesity epidemic?
To be honest, I don't really think of myself as I know I have that on my Patreon, like a health coach. I kind of think of myself as a person on the internet with an opinion.
Yeah.
So I don't really think of myself as having any type of label or anything. But yeah, I talk to lots of people that are interested in losing weight, and I my thought is that if the pulse and temperature are low, like I talked to somebody with a 93 temperature, a Fahrenheit temperature. I don't know what that is in Celsius, but that is extremely low. Like if a 37 degrees Celsius or 98.6 is normal, that's so far under 98.6. And that would suggest that their thyroid function was extremely suppressed. And so anyways, if that's occurring, I think a person is just going to be on a slow trajectory towards weight gain. Like cells won't be able to perspire correctly, and new fat will be easily synthesized and stored. And then there's photos I really like, old people that were hypothyroid, and they look just like normal obese people. And they take some thyroid hormone, so that's usually a combination of T3 and T4, and they look like different people. Like I think if you go to my Twitter right now on August 18th, you can. It's probably one of the last things I posted. But they look like they've lost 100 pounds, and it's not from eating more and or eating less and exercising more. It's from taking like 2 grains of thyroid hormone. So. And then, like I'm kind of a reluctant filmer of myself. I have been making videos for many years, and I could point to each video and be like, I'm taking thyroid hormone in this one. I'm not taking thyroid hormone in this one. And it appears to me that my whole face will change when I'm taking thyroid, and a bunch of characteristic stuff will happen when I'm not taking it. So, anyways, I think thyroid and obesity have a very tight relationship, and the thyroid suppressive culture and nutrition and being irradiated by cell phone towers and now 5G towers and stuff, none of that's helping. It's all causing chronic stress. I recall an older paper where they installed like a 2G tower in Germany or something, and they found that the inhabitants of the town started releasing more adrenaline. So just being around an old school cell phone tower was harmful. So I can't even imagine how bad it is these days. It's probably 1,000 times worse.
The it's interesting because it makes you totally, this focus on hormones makes you view the problem from a different angle, because basically like we know, for example, like a slim person is like being slim, it's associated with a number of health benefits, and being obese, conversely is associated with a number of negative health consequences. Increased rate of injury, etc., whatever. But when you think about the hormones, your way of viewing it differs, because instead what you start to think is the person isn't healthy because they're slim. They're slim because they're healthy. There are people who are slim because they jump on treadmills, usually neurotic women, like jump on treadmills for an hour and a half, barely eat anything. And they'll be slim. But then there's the person who sort of effortlessly remains slim, and presumably that's because they have like a healthy hormonal profile. So is that a better way of looking at it, do you think?
Yeah, I think that's moving in the right direction. Like one thing talking to many people, over the last few years, was that it's extremely hard to identify like what is health and what isn't. Especially depending on how even a person looks or their weight or whatever. Like I've talked to obese people that I thought were healthier than extremely lean young men.
Mm.
And so I don't even it's like a hard thing to even it's like if you wanted to know if somebody was healthy or not, maybe spend a week with them or something. Like
Yeah.
that would be like the only way to really know, because and also what you said, there's something called the obesity paradox. And Georgie, my co-host of the Generative Energy podcast, he's done lots of work on this, where like in a dangerous surgery, an obese person is way more likely to survive than a leaner person. And so again, there's probably a bunch of things accounting for that, but a lean person can be in an extreme state of stress, and they can have very high stress hormones that are constantly liberating fatty acids and using those fat as a fuel, and causing lots of harm doing that. And then an obese person can be safely storing away fat and not oxidizing it as a main fuel, so kind of sparing themselves damage. And so if you get into the obesity paradox, it really makes a person question everything. And again, I'm not saying, oh, you want to be obese or something. I'm just saying it's so hard to nail down like health from an appearance. And again, that idea has just been like destroyed for me talking to lots of people, because it's I would say the young 20s man that's real lean and has really bad health problems are some of the most like unhealthy people I've talked to. They're in a really bad state. So it's super hard to quantify, I think.
I think that's super interesting. The thing is, I feel like intuitively you can kind of tell this. It sounds weird, but like there's like a certain overweight person where I don't know, like they like, the stereotype, like the jolly chubby dude. Like the only caveat that I wanted to add would be, aren't a lot of toxins stored in fat? I don't know, is that correct? Like a lot of bad things are stored in body fat. Is that correct?
I've heard that forever. As far as I know, that is true, but it's probably better than them being in the blood. So it's that's kind of what I was getting at with if you're storing or you're laying down fat, it doesn't have a chance to be oxidized by cells, and it can't damage them. And so it sounds very counterintuitive, I know, but it's maybe taking the temperature and pulse or something would be a way over the course of a day, would be an easier way to denote health than just looking at a person. And also like a person's philosophy, usually you have to talk to them, and like we've all met the person that can't, maybe looks good, or like, oh, so for example, in San Francisco, I knew lots of ballet dancers who were models, and they look like they were chiseled out of stone, but a lot of them could not tolerate any dissent from their point of view. A lot of them had depression. All the girls I talked to unanimously had freezing cold hands, freezing cold feet. And a joke among them was when they retired at, like, I don't know, 30 or so, they just blow out instantly and gain tons of weight, because their whole career was basically like starvation. And so that was one of my big things that started to get me to think differently about health. And then, of course, talking to hundreds of people that has helped as well.
Yeah, well, I actually just you mentioning that there's this dude at Brazilian Jiu Jitsu who's like super lean. He's in like he's in his 40s. He's super lean, super muscular. But I noticed like um sometimes like if it's a little colder, like the dude will literally start shivering like almost uncontrollably to the point
Yeah.
where he can't really participate. And I remember looking at that and having like read, you know, your work and yeah, it's like, oh, that's not a good sign. But anyway, yeah, I think what you're saying is very interesting. I like it. It's a more holistic view, and it is so true that some of the most unhealthy people you will meet are physically or by appearance. Yeah, they could be in a quote unquote good state, but I wanted to switch. We'll speak about something else now. I wanted to talk a little bit about serotonin because you know a couple of these hormones come up. It's like serotonin, thyroid, cortisol. Now, in popular culture, serotonin is often like referred to as the happy hormone. If you are depressed and you go speak to your a doctor or psychiatrist, they might prescribe you an SSRI, you know, a serotonin reuptake inhibitor or whatever they're called, to which will boost your serotonin levels. The idea being that that will, you know, somehow relieve your depressive symptoms. But I think that you have a very different view of serotonin.
Yeah, I mean, that was completely inspired by Ray. You know, he has some classic articles on the subject, and this goes back to hair loss, but one of the hormones that I was interested in was called prolactin, and it's like a pituitary hormone that in birds actually causes like the loss of feathers and things. And in the animal world, it's like not very controversial that it causes the loss of hair. And so when I was in California, I remember going to colleges and checking out these old textbooks where they all talked about prolactin and its loss of hair in animals. But that information is just like completely lost and barely ever talked about in today's like textbooks. But anyways, when I was getting into Ray's kind of seeming like his contrarianism, when he was talking about serotonin, I was open to the idea, but then he started linking papers talking about how serotonin increased prolactin, and I was like, oh well, that can't be good.
Mm.
And then serotonin activating the adrenals directly to increase cortisol, and I was like, that can't be good either. Like, there's no way you want to increase serotonin. And from my understanding, it's a really old. I don't know if it's not necessarily a hormone. I think it might be like a signaling substance or something, but it's a really old substance that is produced primarily in the intestine, not the brain. And I think its basic function is to like expel the contents of the intestine if somebody eats something poisonous. And so people with diarrhea and things will usually have very high levels of serotonin, and anti-serotonin drugs like ciprofloxacin or ondansetron or probably something as other drugs can help stop that pretty quickly. But yeah, in old articles, I used to call it like the misery hormone because it just seems to be involved in like every bad aspect of life. I think one paper called it like a hormone that's involved in the drive to withdraw and seek contentment and not like seek out novelty seeking behavior. And so, I mean, is there anything better that describes our society than like, just like, I don't want to get involved. I don't want to rock the boat, you know, like, and so it's, I mean, we probably live in a hyper serotonin culture, you know, most people probably have high serotonin, but yeah, anyways, long story short, it seems to be involved in every pathological problem, and lowering it seems to be really therapeutic.
Yeah, it's linked with I think another thing that demonstrates like how perhaps dangerous it is this the rat studies and the notion of like learned helplessness. Could you go into that a little bit?
Yeah, not my. I haven't read a ton about it, but I think it's just chronic stress, experiencing chronic stress, and then basically like that drive to withdraw, seek contentment. Like even if an opportunity was available to escape the stress, the person or the animal will not seek it. Or another, I think, experiment that demonstrates it is that they're kind of like fucked up experiments, but they'll put like two jars of water, like tubes, and they'll drop a rat in it, and the rat the rat that has like high serotonin will will give up and drown pretty quickly, whereas the rat in a better metabolic state will swim for like days or something.
What's his name? That Christopher Walker dude, who I think he does like these popular video essays, which are very much inspired by Ray Peat, and he had one on serotonin. And basically, what he was saying is, if you look at people on SSRIs, right, it's kind of a difficult thing to say, because if you're on an SSRI, presumably it's because you're depressed, and if you're depressed, you're more likely to commit suicide. But
Mm-hmm.
what they're saying is, even among there can be depressed people who have never exhibited any suicidal tendencies, and if you look at like suicide rates among people who take SSRIs, they're really, really high.
Yeah.
So basically his claim was that, like, like the rat in water, it makes people more likely to just throw in the towel, if you will. So yeah, I think that's pretty interesting. And another thing, so we have this, so cortisol and thyroid, there's this seesaw relationship. When one goes up, the other goes down. And it seems like that's the same with serotonin and dopamine. So maybe you could speak a bit about dopamine. I mean, like, why is it important, and why does it go up when the other goes down?
This is actually one of the areas I'm the most underread on. Georgi Dinkov, my co-host, could probably speak about it pretty intelligently, because I know how complex it is, so I don't want to goof anything up.
Yeah.
Novelty seeking versus contentment, or low metabolism versus high metabolism. Like the MO of a child is seeking novelty, whereas the MO of the adult is just staying at home or not doing things exciting. But I couldn't speak too articulately about it.
It's like, sorry, this is just going back to high metabolism, low metabolism. Another thing is, like, everyone knows that kids are like boundlessly curious, to the point where like their parents end up losing it at them, because it's like, well, why? Well, why? Well, why? Well, why? You know what I mean? It's like this. I think it's why, like, Nietzsche sort of saw the child as like something to aim for, which is another interesting parallel between him and Ray Peat, which is that both of them saw the link between physiology, philosophy, politics, so on and so forth. But then also they saw the child as something to try and emulate, like the curiosity and openness of a child. So anyway, we've spoken. I think now someone who is listening would kind of have the basics, and what they might be thinking now is like, well, okay, what can I do to lower my cortisol, and what can I do to higher my thyroid, or just higher my metabolism? So perhaps we'll just begin by talking about what we can do to enhance your metabolism. What can be done?
Yeah, I mean, it's so multifactorial, and there's so many different places to start. Like, you'll read online about the Ray Peat diet, and I think Ray is horrified at that language, and like people putting together dietary things, which I'm also guilty of, doing that many years ago. But the thing is, like, you could just improve your metabolism going to lay out in the sun at like 2 or 3 p.m. every day, or maybe getting 20 minutes on each side. Or you could go to a new place, a new stimulating place or something, and that could be a metabolic improving activity, or going to hang out with somebody you like or something. But as far, like, since we all have to eat, well, one common thing that Ray does talk about pretty frequently, and I've found that does make a big difference for a lot of people, is it's very easy to get a lot of phosphorus in the diet. So if a person puts in their nutrition to like chronometer.com, they'll usually have a huge excess of phosphorus, and you really have to seek out like calcium containing foods to get enough. And so one of the things Ray talks about is that this is like a chronic type of stress, just getting more phosphorus. And so one of the mechanisms is that the high phosphorus mimics the low energetic state of the cell and activates, you have like 4 glands on the back of your thyroid called the parathyroid glands, and they release the parathyroid hormone, which it basically resembles every feature of aging, including breaking down the person's skeleton. And so it's just a real easy thing to knock out, I think, is getting more calcium in a person's nutrition. And if somebody was skeptical of what I was saying, they could even go measure their parathyroid hormone via a blood test And then a very closely associated hormone is called prolactin, which I talked about earlier. And so you could get like blood tests of these things if a person really wanted to see. But even the like getting milk and cheese or something is hard these days because a lot of cheeses have really terrible additives in them in the grocery store. And like I'm usually always saying Parmigiano Reggiano cheese because it's one of the only safe cheeses I know of. And then a lot of people have milk allergies. And so if both of those didn't work, maybe even grinding down some eggshells and powdering them and adding them to food or using it as a supplement is another way to try to get more calcium. I can go through more things.
Ray, I think he spoke about a group of African pastoralists. I can't remember what they're called, but they apparently would consume something like 5,000 milligrams of calcium a day, which is pretty crazy. How much do you? I understand that like what you do, you're not prescribing to other people, and hopefully the person listening does as well. But what do you sort of aim for? I mean, I generally I think I get something like, I hope I'm getting these measurements right, but something like maybe 2,000 milligrams a day. That's generally what I get, between 2 and 3.
Really good, I think. The Maasai, I think, were the people that ate like 5,000, or I think I have one paper that says they ate 7,000. Yeah, there's a paper by a guy named Fujita, and he talks about how this is like repeatedly misunderstood in the health world, that people think eating calcium will calcify you, and roughly the opposite is true. Like the high parathyroid hormone will drive calcium into the soft tissues, and then eating calcium or eating vitamin D or K or magnesium, whatever, will actually suppress the parathyroid hormone and allow calcium to go where it should be, the bones and teeth and things. But yeah, in that paper by Fujita, he towards the end, he says, I can't remember, maybe it's 2,000 or 2,500. And then Ray has said, I think he shoots for like over 3,000 or something, or he used to. I don't know what he's doing right now, but yeah, it's I think it's a big buffer against stress, you know. And it's funny because for a long time I thought calcium was the most boring like nutrient imaginable. I thought it was like worthless, and it turns out that it's just so central to adaptation and keeping the energy systems high and keeping the stress low.
Another thing to add would be, I noticed, so like I said before, that I experienced sleeplessness, and even growing up, I struggled with insomnia for a long, long time. And anyone who's experienced like proper insomnia, like, you know, having almost no sleep for maybe 5 or 6 days in a row, it's one of the worst things you can experience. And I noticed that ever since not so much turning to Ray Peat's principles, but just introducing carbohydrates and eating a more like well-rounded diet, I've actually, for the first time in my life, I've had no sleep issues. And I drink like a liter of milk basically every single night. Not before I go to bed as well, which might seem like weird, but I'm not saying that that's not necessarily related, but I do believe that the reason I'm able to sleep soundly is because I'm less stressed. And this is a good example of how things just spiral, right? Because, you know, perhaps you're feeling stressed because of something, maybe even as simple as like a poor calcium to phosphorus ratio. So you sleep poorly, and then you wake up, and because you slept poorly, you start to get a bit more stressed. And because you get a bit more stressed, you sleep poorly. You know, it's like things can spiral out of control, and then you can see how like cortisol leads to more cortisol. So yeah, it's interesting. I guess maybe we could speak a little bit about just some other ways of perhaps, because I guess you can speak about both things. You know, how do we increase the metabolism? Well, in order to do that, we need to get rid of the things that decrease it. So you can speak about both how to increase and what to avoid, what to do and what to avoid.
Yeah, and what you said is so true. Like the vicious cycle of stress amplifying itself, you know. And think if you have obligations every day, or kids, or a job, and go into that with no sleep. I mean, I talk to lots of people that experience that. So the Ray has a quote. It's like you can't know where you're going if you don't know where you are. So I would recommend people maybe taking their pulse and temperature in the morning, and then checking it again in the afternoon, just to get a rough outline of like of where your thyroid function is, and that just makes everything easier, you know. And then if that were low, like doing what you were talking about, like increasing the carbohydrate if a person was eating like a low carb nutrition, trying that carrot salad, that famous carrot salad if somebody had intestinal problems, trying more calcium if they knew that the phosphorus was high and they were eating a deficient amount of calcium, or like eating liver and oysters if they never did that. Like just experimenting with these kind of low hanging fruits and seeing how they felt. And then if things were so far gone or they were in a terrible state of health or something, then and just experimenting sounded daunting. Like maybe getting some lab work or something, like basic labs to investigate the problem, because sometimes that can cut through so much nonsense. And there are some things you really can't guess. Like you can't really guess where your cholesterol is, and that's another proxy for thyroid function and high cortisol and things.
Wait, hang on a second.
And
Is high cholesterol, would being high cholesterol, would that be good for thyroid function?
So in old age, your cholesterol going up is definitely a good thing. I think it's like an adaptation. But if a person has a very low temperature and pulse rate and their cholesterol is like 6 or 7 or something, or 250 or above that, or I don't know, 220, 230, and they have a low temperature and pulse rate, that's like a very old metric for hypothyroidism. That like it's what we talked about earlier. Like thyroid is turning over your cholesterol into these steroids like pregnenolone, progesterone, and DHEA. And so when your thyroid is suppressed, your cholesterol tends to rise. And so it's actually really like relatively simple, but it's like physicians and a lot of health people will make it sound like the most confusing thing on the planet. Like we have no idea why cholesterol increases and we have no idea why it decreases. Like there's a paper that I really enjoy, and it was taking the cholesterol of students before a big test and then immediately after. And their cholesterol goes up before the big test and then down after. And so it just shows how it's like rising to meet this person's need to get through this stress, and then decreases immediately after. So if an older person, they have cholesterol that's going up, they're in like a long, steady state of adaptation to stress over a lifetime, I think.
And I think what the advice you gave is very good. It's like, before you know where you're going, you need to know where you're at. So getting perhaps, what are they called? Would you use like a Fitbit to take the heart rate and one of those VIX temperature things to find out? How would you go about doing that?
Yeah, that could work. The VIX, I had used that for years, just a digital thermometer, and would put it under my armpit and take 2 or 3 readings, and then just take the highest one. And that, Broda Barnes, the thyroidologist doctor, he didn't really use digital stuff, but I'm pretty sure that's exactly how he did it. And I guess the thyroid has a circadian rhythm, so it should be lowest in the morning when you wake up and highest in the afternoon. And so measuring both of those for maybe 2 or 3 days and trying to find the average is probably a good course of action. And if it's just chronically low, it would be interesting to see how the person felt with higher pulse rate and higher temperature. I think Ray said that he thought those were indicative of how alive the person was. And then Broda said that those were the tempo of life. And so it can really, really change things when they increase.
I think in generative energy, the book that I didn't really understand, I still got like the reason I actually turned to your work is because I did find it more accessible. And also someone like Kate Deering as well.
Yeah,
she wrote this book, Healing Metabolism, where I could tell Ray was like a genius, and I could tell that he had a number of really interesting and important insights, but I just didn't have the scientific vocabulary to deal with his books. Nevertheless, I did get, some things out of them that inspired me to go to the secondary sources, I guess, and try and learn from that. But one of the lines from it was basically talking about how there are certain things where they're not actually that complex. We haven't yet integrated our scientific knowledge into questions of psychology and philosophy. You probably remember the quote better. Do you know what I'm talking about? Where it's like at this, I think it's at the start where he's saying we have all of this like scientific knowledge that we're yet to really integrate into our lives.
Yeah, yeah. I know what you're talking. I don't think Ray thinks anything is finished or that he's figured it out or something.
Yeah.
I think he thinks like the state of things is in disrepair, and he's mining like nuggets of ideas and things to put together. But like he will frequently say things went off the rails in about 1947, and a bunch of stuff happened that year. But I think that's when the AMA was created, the American Medical Association, and I think, or maybe the contraceptive pill was created that year. I can't remember, but he talks about the whole scientific field basically going off in this neo-Darwinian genetic determinism direction. And I mean, if you read enough of Ray, he basically rejects that wholesale. And so that, yeah, he has, he has, I think it's in Nutrition for Women, something saying like, if we accept that knowledge is tentative, we'll be less reluctant to give up our pet ideas or something that we have. So I think that's why he hates protocols, and I think it like is probably pretty annoying to him of people talking about the Ray Peat diet and things, because he has another kind of famous quote about the only protocol is to perceive, think, and act. And so, and following something that somebody wrote down for you is the complete opposite of that, you know?
Well, it's obvious that some of the most negative health consequences that people experience at the moment are not just a result of eating a standard diet, but of actually trying to get healthy. Like we've both given the example of like a ketogenic diet, which I'm not, again, I'm sure that for some people, maybe that actually is good. But, you know, when someone goes, here's how you get healthy, you do A, B, C. Well, you start doing A, B, C. And if you don't think, perceive, act, well, you know, like you're being keto and you notice, hey, my hair's thinning and I'm not sleeping. But you know, carbs are bad. So, you know, it's like, so you're not thinking, you're not perceiving, and then you're not acting based on those thoughts and perceptions. So yeah, it's absolutely essential to be, and I'm sure that again, like I have a friend who he did like, you know, the 2 liters of, you know, he drank like 2 liters of orange juice, drank a lot of milk, drank a lot of table sugar, and he noticed his skin start to get bad. So what did he do? He cut back on those things, and he found there were some improvements. That's thinking, that's perceiving, that's acting. And he's still obviously, he's not he still is very much interested in the thought of Ray Peat. He just noticed that for whatever reason, those things at that time were not good for him, and he didn't just stick to them regardless. So
yeah, what kind of health advice is to like, oh, is that's you think that's harming you? Oh, just do it harder then. Like but that's like almost the story of my nutritional career, I guess, like going from veganism to vegetarianism. It's like no pain, no gain. And I really don't think that's the road, like a successful road. It's just going to probably harm a person. And so, yeah, man, again, Ray is just this unique voice in this arena. And he's like person first rather than some like arbitrary idea first. And so, but I think that does get lost quite a bit, because like a person that's really sick sometimes has like an air of desperation, and they don't really want to talk about philosophy or of how to approach nutrition or supplements or something. Understandably so, you know, you just want to get better. But I think that's something most of the people that are in this space will eventually learn, that you really you can have a stimulating conversation with somebody, but trying to control them and to deactivate their navigating principle is probably about the worst thing you can do for a person.
So I want to finish off with one last question, and that's you know, how food has been used as a form of political control. So we know that for instance, like the Jesuits in South America actually used food to control natives, and that's not a conspiracy, it's a historical fact. And I'm just curious, do you think that food is being used as a sort of form of political control today? Because when we think about the sort of foods that are recommended as health foods, you can't help but notice that they're the sort of things that might lower your metabolism, like nuts and things like that. But then, just like the promotion of monocrops, soy, GMOs, etc. Do you think that it is being used as a form of political control, or do you think it's just what's profitable?
Yeah, you probably know more about this than I do, but I think in nutrition for women, Ray says the government tells people to eat beans and bread for a reason, or something like that. And then I had the Orthodox Christian dude Jay Dyer on my podcast in like 2019, and he was talking about in Plato's Republic of talking about feeding the slaves crackers and stuff to like reduce their consciousness or something. So I, like you said, I think it has a long precedent, and I mean, at this moment, it's impossible for me to think otherwise that that's what's going on here. Like the bugs and demonizing animal foods and things like that. And I think there are even books written about this, like death by food pyramid, and going into how the food pyramid was created. And of course they're changing it even more these days, like trying to demonize, or I heard the term food racism like 2 days ago or something. It was it's just totally crazy. So
It's like the milk as well. You notice that
yeah, like
now.
white supremacy milk or whatever.
Yeah. Nothing screams white supremacy like a glass of milk. Um, my friend, the raw egg nationalist, he has a book called "The Eggs Benedict Option," and it's all about how food is being used as a form of political control in this age. Talking specifically about like the World Economic Forum. It just came out. I haven't yet read it, but I plan to read it. And maybe it's a yeah. Uh,
No,
I like the idea.
I really enjoy to read it because yeah, it's pretty spooky, and you probably know more than most people of how bad it can get being in Australia. So it's yeah, it's scary times. The last 2 years for a lot of the people I've been talking to, have been really hard. And I don't think it's. I mean, my gut instinct is that it's not going to get better, and that it's going to get worse. And so, yeah, I think everybody should prepare accordingly.
I would love to. I mean, I don't really know much about these things, but I feel like Australia, in terms of its actual food supply, is pretty good. We're such a big country, and farming is something that we actually do. So, for example, like where I shop at like the equivalent of like, um, I guess maybe Whole Foods in America. What it is it's totally locally sourced uh ingredients or whatever, totally locally sourced food from the region, from the farms. Um, you never experience any supply chain issues. So when things are in shortage, they're never in shortage in like what is effectively like a supermarket where I shop, and that's because they're just taking from the area. And this is a big chain. It's up and down the east coast of Australia. Um, so yeah, I mean, in regards to food, I think we're pretty lucky in this country, just being such a big country and having access to yeah, what we do. But in other regards, yes, you're right. Australia has been a very interesting. It's been very surprising to see what happened. But anyway, Danny, it's been lovely to speak to you. I feel I've learned a lot, and I hope that the people listening have learned a lot as well. Perhaps you could just finish off by saying where people can find your work.
Yeah, right back at you, Russell. Total pleasure. I'm t.me/Danny Roddy is my Telegram. DannyRoddy.com is my website. And then I do coaching on patreon.com/Danny Roddy. And those are probably the best places to find me.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much, Danny. Well, enjoy the rest of your day, or enjoy the rest of your afternoon. And yeah, look forward to more of your content. I always enjoy listening to your podcast and watching your videos. So
You too, brother. Total pleasure. Thanks for having me.
have a good one.